People think theft happens in the dead of night or down a dark alley. Mine happened under fluorescent lights, while I was unconscious on a hospital gurney, and by the time I woke up, they'd used my own fingerprint to strip me of 40 years of work. My name is Martha Reynolds. I'm 68 years old. And this is the story of how trust, my trust, became a doorway that someone else walked right through. It was late March when I checked into the Lakeside Surgical Center for a minor procedure to remove a small cyst behind my left ear. Nothing serious. I'd had more worrisome things removed in my lifetime. The nurses were polite, the front desk was efficient, and the walls were that same soft beige you see in every medical building, like they were painted to make you feel calm even if you weren't. I'd done everything right, filled out my paperwork, confirmed my insurance, left emergency contacts. That morning, I even called my daughter, Denise, to let her know I'd be home by mid-afternoon. She offered to drive me, but I told her not to fuss. I've always been the sort who prefers handling things myself. Independent to a fault, Denise would say. They brought me into pre-op around 9:30. A young nurse, I remember she had a blue butterfly pin on her badge, helped me into a gown. She took my vitals and asked me to remove my jewelry, my watch, anything that might interfere with equipment. I handed over my belongings, including my purse, which she placed in a labelled bin beneath the gurney. It all seemed standard. The anesthesiologist came in next, a man with kind eyes and a voice that reminded me of my late husband, low and reassuring. He explained the sedation process, told me I might feel a little groggy afterward, and asked if I had any questions. I didn't. I'd done this sort of thing before. I signed the final consent form without hesitation. Then he said, "All right, Mrs. Reynolds, I'm going to have you count backward from 10. I remember thinking that was the oldest trick in the book, but I started anyway. 10, 9, 8. I never made it past 7. When I woke up hours later, my throat was dry, and there was a dull ache at the base of my skull. The nurse with the butterfly pin was gone, replaced by an older woman who offered me a cup of ice chips and said the procedure went well. I thanked her, still groggy, and reached for my purse as soon as she wheeled me back to the recovery area. I didn't notice then that it wasn't exactly where I'd left it, or that the zipper was only halfway closed. In that moment, all I cared about was going home, getting into my own bed, and sleeping off the anesthesia. I signed my discharge papers, arranged a ride through a medical transport service, and within an hour I was standing in my living room, the afternoon sun slanting through the curtains like nothing in the world had changed. I had no idea, not the faintest suspicion that while I was under, someone had used my own fingerprint to empty the account I'd spent 40 years saving. No alarms, no notifications, just a quiet theft, perfectly timed to when I was most defenseless. And that was only the beginning. When I think back to that first night home, it was the small things that should have told me something wasn't right. The way my keys were sitting on the edge of the counter instead of in my bag. How my phone was placed screen down on the end table when I always kept it charging near the kitchen. Even the smell of the house felt off somehow, like stale air had settled in every corner while I was away. But at 68, you get used to telling yourself you're imagining things. I'd just been sedated, after all. I was tired, disoriented. Maybe I'd set my things down without remembering. Maybe the nurse had been the one to tuck my phone away. I tried to let it go. I made myself a cup of weak tea and sat in my recliner with a blanket pulled up to my chin. My neighbour, Mr. Sandoval, had insisted on walking me to the door when the transport van dropped me off. He hovered in the doorway, asking if I was sure I didn't need help getting settled. I assured him I was fine, but as soon as he left, I felt lonelier than I had in years. That night, I drifted in and out of shallow sleep. Each time I woke, there was that nagging pull in my stomach, a feeling I couldn't name. By dawn, It had settled into something like dread. I tried to brush it away. I had bills to pay, appointments to reschedule. Life doesn't stop just because you're uneasy. I remember telling myself that more than once as I shuffled to my desk and opened my laptop. My checking account was the first thing I planned to look at. The power bill was due, and I wanted to pay it before I forgot. I typed in my username, my password, and waited for the familiar blue screen to load. Instead of the balance I expected, just over $28,000, I saw a number so small it didn't register at first. $14.72. I stared at it, closed the tab, reopened it. Same number. My heart started to tap against my ribs. I clicked on Recent Activity. A long list of withdrawals unspooled in neat black type, each one dated for the afternoon I'd been in surgery. Withdrawals of $900, $800, $600, one after the other. A few minutes apart, like someone had been emptying the account in a controlled, deliberate way. I picked up the phone, but my hand was shaking so badly I had to set it back down. For a few minutes, I just sat there, pressing my palm to my chest, trying to make sense of it. It had to be a mistake, a glitch. That was the only explanation that made sense. I called the bank's customer service line, my voice wobbling as I recited my account number. The woman on the other end sounded impossibly young, the kind of voice that made me feel even older. She pulled up my records and asked me to verify my last transactions. I told her I hadn't made any. "Ma'am," she said gently, "the withdrawals were conducted in person, using the biometric verification system. The fingerprint matched." I was so stunned, I forgot how to breathe. "My fingerprint?" I whispered. "Yes, ma'am," she said again. "It shows here the account holder authenticated each transaction with a biometric scan." I felt everything go cold. I was in that surgical suite when those withdrawals happened. Sedated, hooked up to monitors. I hadn't walked into any bank, but someone had, and they'd taken every dollar I'd saved to carry me through the rest of my life. When I finally hung up, my hands were damp with sweat. I looked around my quiet house. The photos on the mantel, the crocheted blanket draped over the back of the sofa, and I felt something I hadn't felt in a very long time. Powerless. I didn't know yet who had done this, or how they'd planned it so perfectly. But in that moment, I made myself a promise. I wouldn't let whoever did this think they'd chosen an easy target. They thought I'd be too old to fight back. They were wrong. The next morning, I woke up before sunrise, my mind already churning. It felt like all the quiet, predictable rhythms of my life had been ripped up overnight and replaced with questions I didn't know how to answer. I've always believed in meeting problems head-on. That's something my husband used to say about me. Martha doesn't wait around to be rescued. Maybe that's why I found myself sitting in my car by 8:15 a.m., gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles were white. I don't drive much these days. My hands ache if I hold the wheel too long, and my eyes aren't as sharp as they used to be. But I wasn't about to call a cab or ask a neighbor to come along. This was my fight. When I walked into the bank branch, I could feel people glancing my way. Maybe they saw an elderly woman with her shoulders hunched and assumed I was there to deposit a birthday check or ask about a fee. No one suspected I'd come to demand answers about the theft of my entire savings. At the teller window, I asked to speak with a manager. The young man behind the glass looked startled, but he nodded and disappeared into a back office. A few minutes later, a woman in a charcoal suit with a name tag reading Patricia ushered me into a small meeting room. I told her everything. The procedure, the sedation, the withdrawals I hadn't authorized. Her polite smile faded as she scrolled through my records on her tablet. "There are security images attached to these transactions," she said finally. "Would you like to review them?" I nodded, bracing myself. She turned the screen toward me. I thought I was prepared. But the moment I saw the first still frame, I felt my stomach drop. It was me, or rather, my body. My face looked pale, my eyes glassy. I was wearing the same clothes I'd worn to the clinic, but there was something vacant in my expression, something I didn't recognize. Next to me stood a woman in a surgical mask and a grey hoodie. One gloved hand was curled around my wrist. The other was pressing my thumb firmly onto the biometric scanner. I felt sick. Patricia spoke carefully, as if trying not to spook me. These withdrawals were processed under our highest level security measures. They required your fingerprint each time. That's why the funds weren't flagged as suspicious. I looked at her, trying to understand how a bank could accept a transaction when the account holder was clearly not acting of her own will. But Patricia only shifted in her chair and said the words I dreaded hearing. Until we have definitive evidence that you were incapacitated or coerced, the bank's position is that the transactions were valid. I opened my mouth, then closed it. What about the woman in the mask? I asked finally, my voice so thin it barely sounded like mine. We'll include the images in our internal investigation, Patricia said, not meeting my eyes. But it will take time. Time. That was the one thing I didn't feel I had in abundance. When I left the bank, I sat in my car for a long time. The sun was high overhead, warm on my face. But inside, everything felt cold. I thought about the list of transactions, each withdrawal like a small knife taken to the life I'd built. The money wasn't just numbers on a screen. It was security, dignity, the freedom to stay in my home without burdening my daughter. I thought of Denise and how she'd insisted I let her drive me to the clinic. If I'd listened, maybe none of this would have happened. But regret wouldn't fix anything. I pulled out my phone and dialed the police non-emergency line. My hand trembled as I explained that I needed to file a fraud report. When the officer asked me if I had any idea who might have done this, I surprised myself by answering without hesitation. Yes, I said quietly. I think it was someone at the surgical center. Someone who knew exactly when I'd be unable to defend myself. He asked if I had proof. I closed my eyes, picturing the woman in the mask guiding my hand to the scanner. Not yet, I whispered, but I'm going to find it. And for the first time in days, I felt a flicker of something I hadn't allowed myself to feel. Determination. The days that followed were the longest I can remember. From the outside, it probably looked like nothing had changed in my house. The curtains were still drawn at sunset. The bird feeder still needed filling. I still called Denise every evening to tell her I was fine. But inside, I was awake at all hours, replaying every detail of that morning at the clinic. The clipboard of forms, the nurse with the butterfly pin, the way she kept asking where I banked, in a tone that I thought was only polite conversation. The more I thought about it, the clearer it became. This was no crime of opportunity. Someone had planned it. They had known exactly when I would be unconscious, how to get my ID and card without arousing suspicion, and how to exploit the bank's biometric system. I started writing everything down. Names, times, any remark that seemed odd. My handwriting was cramped and uneven from arthritis, but I filled 3 pages of a yellow legal pad in 2 days. I called the police again, this time speaking with Detective Howard. He sounded tired, but patient. I told him about the young aide at the clinic, the one who had been so interested in my schedule and my living situation. She disappeared the week after my surgery, I said. I asked the receptionist where she went, and they just said she no longer worked there. That's worth looking into, he agreed. Do you have a full name? I gave him what I remembered Kayla Jennings, and he promised to run her through their system. After we hung up, I sat back in my chair and stared at the notepad. Even with all the pieces I'd gathered, it didn't feel like enough. Not to prove to the bank that I hadn't walked in willingly. Not to reclaim the money I'd spent 40 years saving. I tried to think of anything else. any trail she might have left. Then I remembered the personal bin they'd tucked under my gurney, where I'd placed my purse and phone. The aide had been the last one to handle it before I was wheeled away. I called the clinic and asked to speak with the office manager. A woman named Carla came on the line. She sounded pleasant enough, right up until I explained what had happened. "We don't have any reason to believe our staff were involved," she said crisply. "All patient belongings are logged and supervised." "I understand," I said as evenly as I could, "but you have security cameras in the pre-op area. I'd like to request access to that footage." There was a pause, so long I thought the line had gone dead. "Mrs. Reynolds, our policy doesn't allow patients to review internal security recordings without a subpoena." A subpoena. The word felt as heavy as a brick. I thanked her, hung up, and stared at the phone. It was the first time I realized how alone I really was in this fight. I thought about calling Denise, about telling her everything, letting her handle the calls and the paperwork. But then I imagined the look on her face, equal parts pity and frustration, and something inside me hardened. I am not helpless. I opened my laptop and started searching for a lawyer who handled elder financial exploitation cases. It took the better part of an afternoon, but I finally found a small firm downtown that offered a free consultation. I made an appointment for the next morning. That night, I sat in bed and read every article I could find about biometric fraud. It was more common than I'd ever imagined. Older adults, people recovering from illness, easy targets, the articles called them. I closed my eyes and pictured the woman in the video still. The latex glove on her hand. The way she held my thumb against the scanner as if she were punching in her own code. I couldn't get her out of my mind. When dawn came, I was already dressed. I put my papers in a folder and locked the front door behind me. If no one else was going to protect me, I would do it myself. And I wasn't going to stop until I had proof that even a sedated woman still has a voice. I don't think I'll ever forget the feeling of sitting across from that lawyer in his quiet little office, my folder of notes clutched in both hands. The walls were lined with books I couldn't read from where I sat, and the clock over the door ticked in a slow, deliberate way that made me feel even older. His name was Mr. Carlson. He looked to be in his mid-50s, with thinning hair and the kind of calm voice that made you feel you were already halfway to being believed. He listened without interrupting as I told him the whole story, from the clinic to the bank to the phone call with the office manager who'd practically slammed the door in my face. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and folded his hands over his stomach. "Mrs. Reynolds," he said, "you've done more groundwork on this than many people half your age. You've documented everything, and you have partial evidence that supports your account." I felt my eyes sting. It was the first time anyone had said out loud that I wasn't imagining it. "But," he continued, "to pressure the bank to return the funds and to build a case for criminal charges, you're right. We need more than partial evidence." "The clinic footage," I said quietly. He nodded. "Exactly. We'll file an emergency motion to request that video before it's overwritten. In the meantime, I'd like your consent to formally contact the detective you've been speaking with." I agreed without hesitation. He handed me a pen to sign the release, and as I scrawled my name, I felt something uncoil in my chest. Maybe I wasn't as powerless as I'd thought. The next few days passed in a blur of phone calls and paperwork. I gave statements to the police, signed affidavits, answered more questions than I can remember. Each evening, I would sit in my kitchen with a cup of tea, the same lamp glowing on the table, and wait for news. It was early on a Wednesday morning when my phone finally rang. I didn't recognize the number, but something told me to answer anyway. "Mrs. Reynolds," the voice said. "This is Detective Howard. I thought you'd want to know. We located Kayla Jennings." I pressed my hand to my mouth. "She was arrested on an unrelated warrant," he continued. But during processing, she admitted she'd been involved in your case. She claimed she didn't act alone. I swallowed hard. The woman in the video? We believe so. She wouldn't give us a full name, but she described her as a friend who owed her money. In exchange for helping her get access to patient belongings, she was paid in cash. I felt sick all over again. She also confirmed your belongings were taken while you were under sedation, he said. That helps corroborate your account. I thanked him, though the words felt small compared to the weight of what he'd told me. After we hung up, I called Mr. Carlson. He picked up on the second ring, and I repeated everything as best I could. This is a significant development, he said. If we can get the clinic footage, and we have her admission, that's enough leverage to force the bank to reconsider your claim. He promised to call the bank's legal department that day. I spent the afternoon in my living room, too restless to sit still. I kept picturing Kayla's face, the way she'd smiled at me as she fastened the cuff around my arm to take my blood pressure. That night, I couldn't sleep. I thought about how close I'd come to just accepting it, telling myself I was old, that it was too late to fight. I realized that's exactly what people count on. They count on your shame, your fatigue, your fear of being dismissed. But when the call finally came the next morning, it wasn't Detective Howard or Mr. Carlson. It was a number I didn't recognize, and a voice I couldn't place. I believe you're looking for this, the woman said. Before I could ask who she was, she hung up. Moments later, an email arrived with no subject line and a single attachment, a video file. I sat at my kitchen table and clicked it open, and as the footage began to play, my hands started to tremble. Because there, in high-definition clarity, was everything I needed to prove that I had been nothing but a patient, unconscious on a gurney, while someone else decided to steal the rest of my life. The video wasn't grainy or blurred like the bank stills. It was bright and clear, captured from a security camera mounted high in the corner of the pre-op area. I saw myself lying on the gurney, one arm draped over my stomach, my face slack from sedation. My purse sat on the lower shelf of the metal cart beside me. And then Kayla walked into the frame. I don't know what I expected to feel, watching her appear on the screen. Rage, maybe. Grief. But mostly what I felt was a kind of hollow sadness, like I was witnessing a betrayal in slow motion. She glanced over her shoulder, then reached for the cart. In the video, you could see her slip her hand into my purse and pull out my wallet. She didn't even hesitate. She tucked it under her arm and moved out of view. Less than a minute later, she came back, dropped the wallet back in place, and smoothed the blanket over my knees, as if nothing had happened. It was all there. Undeniable, time-stamped proof. I watched it twice, just to be sure I wasn't imagining it. The second time, I paused on the frame where she was walking away. I zoomed in on the edge of the image until the outline of the plastic bag she was carrying was clear. That was the evidence no one could dismiss. For the first time in weeks, I felt something like relief. I forwarded the email to Mr. Carlson with a short note. This is it. Then I called the number that had sent it. It rang twice before a woman answered. I can't tell you my name, she said softly, but I worked there too. I heard what they were saying about you, that you were confused, that you'd probably just misplaced everything. It wasn't right. My throat tightened. Thank you, I whispered. You don't know what this means to me. I do, she said. Good luck. Then she hung up. I sat there for a long time, listening to the refrigerator hum, feeling the quiet of the house settle around me like a blanket. By noon, Mr. Carlson called back. His voice sounded different, more energized than I'd ever heard it. This changes everything, he said. We're going to draft an emergency petition to present this evidence to the court. Once that's filed, the bank will have no choice but to reconsider their position. The rest of the day passed in a blur of phone calls, emails, and notarized forms. I was tired, bone tired, but it felt different from the exhaustion that had settled over me after the theft. This was purposeful. This was forward motion. The following week, I stood with Mr. Carlson in a small civil hearing room at the county courthouse. The bank's representatives sat across from us, their folders stacked in front of them like a shield. I kept my eyes on the tabletop while Mr. Carlson spoke, laying out every detail, every timestamp, every frame of the footage that proved exactly where I'd been and exactly who had taken what didn't belong to them. When the video played on the mounted screen, the hush that fell over the room felt almost physical. Even the bank's attorneys shifted in their seats. The judge, a woman about my age with a face that reminded me of an old neighbor, leaned forward to watch. I caught the flicker of her expression as Kayla's hand slipped into my purse. It was subtle, but it was there, a tightening of the mouth, a small shake of the head. When the video ended, no one spoke. Mr. Carlson turned to me, and in that moment, I felt the fear that had lived under my ribs for so long start to dissolve. The bank's lead counsel cleared his throat. "Your Honor," he began, his voice careful. "In light of this new evidence, my client would like to propose an immediate settlement and full restitution of Mrs. Reynolds's account." It was the first time in weeks that I exhaled without feeling like I might shatter. The judge nodded, her eyes on me. "Mrs. Reynolds, do you find this resolution acceptable?" I met her gaze and felt the strength in my own voice when I said, "Yes, I do." It wasn't about the money anymore. It was about proving that I hadn't imagined any of it, that even sedated and vulnerable, I still had the right to be heard. When the gavel came down, it was as if the last thread of dread tying me to that day in March finally snapped. And I walked out of that courthouse feeling taller than I had in years. The week that followed felt unreal. Paperwork moved faster than I'd been warned to expect, maybe because the evidence was so plain, or maybe because the bank's attorneys were eager to put the matter behind them before it became public. I still woke up some mornings expecting to find it had all been a dream, that my account was still empty, that no one believed me, that I was just another old woman who couldn't keep her affairs in order. But each day, that feeling receded a little further into the background. On the morning of the final hearing, I dressed carefully in the navy blue suit I had worn to my husband's memorial service. I thought about whether he would be proud of me, whether he'd have been surprised that I found this strength. I decided he wouldn't. He always said I had more grit in me than I knew. When I arrived at the courthouse, Mr. Carlson met me outside. He looked tired, but satisfied. "We're here to finalize the settlement and enter it into the record," he explained. "You won't need to speak unless you want to." I nodded. "I think I'd like to," I said after a moment. Inside, the same judge presided over the proceeding. She reviewed the paperwork, confirmed the restitution, and asked if I had anything to say before she signed. I stood slowly. My hands didn't tremble this time. "I spent 40 years saving that money," I said. My voice was clear, even in the hush of the room. It wasn't just dollars in an account. It was a promise I made to myself that I'd never be a burden to my daughter, that I'd be able to live out my days with dignity. Someone tried to take that from me because they thought I'd be too old and too tired to fight back. I paused, meeting the eyes of the bank's attorneys. "I'm standing here to say that you are never too old to stand up for what you've earned, and you are never too small to be heard." When I sat down, the judge didn't say anything for a moment. Then she nodded and signed the final order. It was done. The bank account was restored that same afternoon. They even sent a letter of apology, though it felt more like a formality than anything genuine. But it didn't matter. The money was back where it belonged. I took the bus home, sitting by the window and watching the city move past. For the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe. In the weeks since, people have asked me if I feel vindicated, if getting the money back erased everything that came before it. The answer is no. Nothing will ever give me back the feeling of safety that was stolen in that surgical suite. I still double-check my doors at night. I still find myself waking in the dark, heart racing, sure that someone has slipped inside again. But that doesn't mean I'm defeated. If anything, what happened taught me that even at 68, especially at 68, I am still the keeper of my own life. That when someone tries to take what you've built, you have every right to stand in their way. A few days after the settlement, Detective Howard called to tell me that Kayla had been formally charged. The woman in the mask was arrested soon after. He said they'd likely face several years in prison. I thanked him, though part of me felt nothing at all. The fight had never been about revenge. It was about the truth. Denise came by the next weekend. She brought a pot of soup and a stack of folded laundry. She didn't say much when I told her the case was closed. She just hugged me so hard I thought my ribs might crack. "You did it, Mum," she whispered. And maybe that was the only victory I needed. These days, my life has settled back into its quiet routines. Morning tea, a walk around the block, a good book in the afternoon light. But some things are different. I've learned to trust my instincts when something feels off. I've learned to ask questions, even if it makes other people uncomfortable. And most of all, I've learned that you can't let fear or shame decide what you do next. If you're listening to this and you've been hurt or stolen from or made to feel small, don't give up. Keep every scrap of evidence. Tell your story, even if your voice shakes. Because no matter your age, you are not invisible. My name is Martha Reynolds. I am 68 years old, and I will never again believe that being quiet is the same as being safe.